to say welcome to School and Society. This is, boy, what is today? April 20th? Yeah, April 20th. And we'll be here for a few minutes today to talk about the teacher evaluation process. I'm going to share my screen with you guys and we'll get to see the general agenda. We started this process last week on April 13th. We'll kind of finish it today. And I just want to walk with you guys through some of the documents that you're very likely to see in your first and second year, especially of teaching, and then some of them you should see throughout your teaching career. So I'll kind of walk you through those documents in the evaluation process, tell you a little bit about how they work. If you have questions, you can interject at any time, or we'll stop at the end if you have questions about those things too. If we have time at the end, what I want you to do is kind of a comparison shopping activity between the what's called the teacher candidate assessment rubric, which is the document you'll be on the hook with for your student teaching. That's how you'll be evaluated for your student teaching. But I'm going to ask you to compare that with what's called the teacher growth guide. And that's in general the document that you'll be on the hook for your career as a classroom educator. So the end result today, if we have time, is I want you to look through both those documents just for comparison purposes. But I want to, as I said, kind of lead you through the process first. So I've used Zoom quite a bit here in the last month or so, but I'm still a little fuzzy on how documents get shared. So if I switch back and forth between my tabs, do you see, like, now is there a picture of a lady on the tab? So you see that, okay, so that's fine. We'll just, we'll do it that way. First thing I'm going to show you is what's called the new teacher feedback forms. And I probably should show you where to find this. So in our course website, in the module that says teacher evaluation, and then there's this thing, this agenda for April 13th and April 20th. When you click on that, that's where the links to all of these documents that I'm going to talk about today exist. So especially if we get to do the final conversations in your smaller groups, I'll invite you to go to this agenda, and then that's where you'll find these documents. But if you want to just sift through them as I'm looking through them too, you're welcome to do that, or go back and just kind of take a look. The way that evaluation works, we've looked at those 9 standards, and I'm sure that with Dr. Rich and others, you've seen the 9 standards in operation too. All the documents that you use for teacher evaluation in your classroom, in your school district, should be based on those standards. Many school districts will just use the straight out DESE documents that I'm going to show you, but some districts will also take the standards and the documents and then adapt their own documents per district. So the documents that you end up using may look a little different, but they should all be based on the same standards, okay? So when you first go out when you get your actual job, when you first go out and teach, you will have what's called your initial teaching certificate. In Missouri, it's called a PC1, Professional Certification 1. In Missouri, that lasts for 4 years. And in the framework of those 4 years, you need to do a few different things, one of which is you have to have at least 30 hours of professional development time. You have to have 2 years of mentor-mentee relationships, and you have to document all of that in theory so that when the second certification process comes around, when you get your PC2, which is a 99-year certification, so they don't call it lifetime anymore, but that's what it is. So when you go for that, you'll have all of these things documented, and you can show the documentation to the person in your district that signs off on that, so that it'll be easier to get your second certification. So I guess the long story short of it is that anytime that you receive documentation for evaluation, anytime that you receive documentation for having worked with a mentor, anything like that, you should probably create files for those things so that if your district asks to see that stuff, and some do and some don't, but if the district asks for it, you should be able to produce it on demand. So all of these documents that I'm going to show you today, as you receive them from your school district, you should also keep track of them too. You should keep them in a file somewhere. My assumption is they'll be delivered to you electronically. That'll be easier to keep track of, but if they're not, you should print a copy and keep them for yourself too. So first thing we look through is this thing called a new teacher feedback form. in some way, shape, or form, it'll look like this. What your district will do, they will assign a mentor to you in the first couple of years that you're teaching. And in the first year, the mentor-mentee relationship will likely be much closer than it is in the second year. The second year, they don't mandate you to be with each other nearly as much. It's possible that the district will also send you to various trainings that are put up by what we call the regional professional development centers. Smaller districts a lot of times will do that. They'll essentially farm out the mentor-mentee stuff. Larger districts a lot of times will do that within the framework of the district itself. But you will have some sort of a mentor. By law, you will have a mentor of some sort in your school district as you start. And theoretically, what you should do is you should take these documents as provided to you by the school district, or maybe the district has their own documents, and you should start kind of working through these documents with your mentor. So, for example, before it says prior to the beginning of the school year, they'll ask you to meet with your mentor teacher and possibly attend some workshop sessions so that you can kind of figure out where you stand on various standards and aspects. So, content knowledge. The mentee prepares lessons to guide students to a deeper understanding of content through planned instruction that reflects an accuracy of content knowledge. You'll be asked to do some sort of a reflection on this, you know. Your mentor teacher looks at that, okay? And you reflect on that with each other. In general, the principal or the administrator does not see this document. This is a document that you can reflect on with your mentor teacher and essentially create some honest conversations between the two of you. Content knowledge, theory of learning, implementing the curriculum, instructional resources, all of these things you theoretically talk about before you even start in your classroom. Then you check back with your mentor sometime during the first month of school, talking about other aspects of standards in general, seeing how it's going. Classroom management becomes a kind of a big deal. And so your principal will likely check in with you on that too, doing some observations on that, but you want to also reflect on that with your mentor. And second and third months of school, you can kind of see how this progresses. Fourth and fifth months of school in the second quarter, mid-year at semester break, doing some reflective activities, third quarter reflective activities, end of the school year reflective activities, and et cetera. And you can kind of sift through that. But this is a document, this new teacher tool, new teacher feedback form that allows you to do that with your mentor teacher. Some districts will use this verbatim, some districts will create their own, and some districts will send you to workshops where they have documents that are based on these as well. Okay, so that's the first document. I'm gonna stop the share here. Thoughts or questions about that? Have you heard of something along those lines before? Okay. Back to share screen. The second document that I'll show you is a kind of a big deal for you as a new teacher. It's the summative evaluation for new teachers. This again is from the DESE website or from those links that I've shared with you. This is summative is the end of the year evaluation. So as a first and second year teacher, this document or a document based on this document with the standards is what you will actually be on the hook for. And it runs through each of the different standards, as you can see. The observations that your administrator has done with you and hopefully the reflective conversations that you've had will hopefully lead your administrator to say meets expectations for, you know, the majority of the standards at least. In some cases, you might, with your administrator, identify growth opportunity areas. That's fine. And you may come to your administrator and you may say, if you have trust in that administrator, you may say, you know, my classroom management is not up to where I want it to be. Can we brainstorm some ideas between the two of us to help me get better in that area? Okay. And so at the end of the first year, for example, you may have those conversations with each other, and the administrator and you will identify that as a growth opportunity as you move into year number 2. And you'll create some sort of plan with each other, and I'll show you that here in a second, about how you might accomplish growth in that area, okay? In some cases, you or most likely your administrator will identify areas of concern. So if we go back to, you know, classroom management again, if I, as your administrator, walk into your classroom 10 different times throughout the school year and 4 of those times I see students throwing things at each other, and 2 of those times the students actually hit each other with things in the classroom, that becomes an area of concern with me. And that's that I would identify on your summative evaluation, and hopefully identify before that as a matter of fact, but certainly on the summative evaluation I would identify that. And so what you can see kind of down at the end here, you know, if you're effective, we don't have any areas of concern, and that would include those growth opportunities. They're not areas of concern, they're just opportunities for growth. Okay, so that would mean that you were effective, and in some cases you may be highly effective. No areas of concern, plus exemplary practice noted, as I write in the comment section as your administrator. Okay. For some teachers, there may be an area of concern. I talked about the classroom management aspect earlier. That's an area of concern we might identify. And then on the summative, you know, we identified that as such. We would consider you an ineffective teacher if there were multiple areas of concern. And you and your administrator would probably have conversations as to what that would look like. Okay. The comments would be made on that. And then you can see on the document, I check this, you know, recommend for reemployment, develop a new or revised growth plan. I can check that too. Develop improvement plan linked to indicators. We'll talk about the difference between a growth plan and an improvement plan here in a few seconds. And in some cases, you may check, you know, do not recommend for reemployment. And the last time we were here, we talked about when those processes should be in place. You know, you should know by March whether you're going to be rehired or not. I have no concerns or no thoughts that any of you won't be, as far as that goes, truly. But that's the process that you would go through, you know, if that were in effect. So that's the summative evaluation. I'll stop the share for a second. Thoughts or questions? I see a bunch of names staring back at me. So, all right, back to the sharing of the screen. So the summative evaluation is the end of year evaluation. Theoretically, what happens at the beginning of the year is you as a teacher, but also every teacher in a building, and theoretically every teacher in a district with their administrators during the beginning of school, at some point either before school or shortly after school begins, you all get together and you discuss as a faculty, as a building, as a district, etc., how you want to grow as educators throughout the course of the year. And you use, to do that, this document that's called a growth guide. It's a huge document. It's like 47 pages. And it's also very confusing because all DESE documents have the same cover on them. So this one is in particular, it's called the growth guide. This breaks down all of the standards, but also all of what they call quality indicators within the standards. So there's standard 1, quality indicator 1, quality indicator 2, you know, et cetera, quality indicator 3. A very common standard that teachers want to improve upon, and districts want their teachers to improve upon, is standard 4, which is called critical thinking. A lot of times districts will be very much in favor of improving the amount of critical thinking that students do in classrooms. And in particular, standard 4, quality indicator 1, instructional strategies leading to student engagement and problem solving and critical thinking. So let me just run through what this might look like if you did this as a teacher in your particular building. So you might, between conversations between maybe your mentor teacher and yourself, or you and your administrator, you might determine that you're a developing teacher in terms of standard 4, indicator 1. So you assure student growth with frequent instructional opportunities for students to use critical thinking and problem-solving skills, but you want to move from being a developing teacher to being a proficient teacher over the course of your school year, okay? So you assure student growth with frequent instructional opportunities for students to use critical thinking, but you want to move into a situation where you actually have different instructional techniques that require students to think critically. So you often give them opportunities, but it's the same style of opportunity. So you want to move into a way that allows you to do that with different methods in your classroom. Okay, so that's the conversation you might have with your administrator. You want to move from developing to proficient. The growth guide has things that you can use as possible sources of evidence. And you can kind of look at some of them here. Professional commitment to critical thinking means you put examples of critical thinking, ideas for critical thinking in your lesson and unit plans. You design your lessons in such a way that you commit to critical thinking. Those are all artifacts that you can show to your administrator, you can show to your mentor teacher. You can come up with a list of instructional strategies, and if you want to move from developing to proficient, which I think is the category, developing to proficient, yeah, you might actually create a list of instructional strategies, and you may pull from that list different instructional strategies that you can use in your classroom to augment critical thinking opportunities. And that's a list that you can show via your lesson plans, or just a list that you created. You can show that to your administrator. You can show it in action in your classroom. And that's one way that you can assess getting better at that particular standard. Professional practice means these are things you actually do in the classroom. So one of those strategies that you've written down might be utilizing class debates. You might use something called a Socratic seminar, which I never used, but I know other social studies teachers, for instance, have used that. So if you're a social studies teacher, you might use that. This Socratic seminar uses debating and other methods requiring students to defend their thinking. And then you might, in the end, what's the professional impact? How do you know that students have done it? Well, you might have reflective journals, okay? That's a practice that you might use. And at the end of this time, or hopefully even not at the end, but all throughout, as your administrator observes and as you have meetings with your mentor teachers and conceivably with other teacher groups in your professional learning communities, you can kind of show these things off so that by the end, when we go back to this summative evaluation, when we go back to this growth guide and we seek to move you along, then we've used these evidence of practice, evidence of impact, and we can move you from developing to proficient. Okay, so that's the growth guide. Stuff like that doesn't really, especially in your first 2 years, doesn't really appear on your summative evaluation. And so for that reason, quite honestly, you probably want to make sure that you keep track of all of the documentation that your principal gives you or that you yourself have when it comes to the growth guides that you're part of, just to make sure that when you have conversations at the end of the year, everybody's on the same page with what you've done. Okay, that's one piece of advice that I would give you, is that anything that you have done, any documentation that you have in terms of conversations with other people, any documentation that your principal, back and forth, that sort of thing, I would encourage you to kind of keep track of those things. All right, back to the share. Next document, growth plan. Let's see if I can find where that is. It's the growth guide. Whoops. There's the growth plan. Okay. So we mentioned that standard 4.1 was something we wanted to move from developing to proficient in terms of our growth guide. The growth plan is kind of how you do that. Okay. So you select the standard, it's critical thinking. You can see it there. I don't know if it, for some reason, it doesn't stay on there. Oh, well. And then you can see 4.1 instructional strategies, you know, that sort of thing, leading to student engagement. Briefly describe why this indicator was selected. It's either part of your CSIP, which means Comprehensive School Improvement Plan, or your BIP, which I'm assuming means Building Improvement. So sometimes as a district, the district will say via the superintendent, here is the standard and the indicator that we want you to work on. Sometimes as a building, you get to make that choice. And sometimes between you as a teacher and the administrator, you can make that choice as a personal period of growth in your classroom. And what you'll do is you'll go through and fill this out. What's your focus? It's 4.1. What's your goal? I want to move from developing to proficient, and I want to do it by such and such a date. Here are my strategies for doing that. And at the end, here's the results that we've had. And theoretically, then what you do is you have ongoing conversations between yourself and the evaluator. You set this baseline score. What did we notice in your classroom, and how do we score that before? What's the follow-up score? I don't know. Some districts don't do that, and I honestly am kind of on the boat where I wouldn't want to do that as a district either, but I would want to have reflective conversations with you as a teacher about where you thought you were. And that's how we would document that if you were in my building. But that's the growth plan. Theoretically, then, what you do as an administrator is you go into classrooms, hopefully a lot throughout the course of the year, and you always do so with documentation. It may look like this. It will probably look like this in some way, shape, or form. It may not be this exact document, but this is an example of an observation form that administrators use when they go into a classroom. And so this is designed for me as an administrator to come in and not sit in your classroom for 45 minutes. That's not what I would do with this document. But I would sit in there for maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes. 10 minutes is a good number, okay? And I would, in that 10 minutes, try to find all of these things on here that you use in the framework of your classroom. And I'm likely not to see all of them in 10 minutes. I hope I don't, because that would just be whiplash for your students. But if I'm in your classroom 10 times in the semester, and I'm in there for 10 minutes each time, then maybe what I do as an administrator is I have one master document like this, and I check off all of these things that I've seen in your classroom. And then at the end, we have conversations about it, you know? Hey, I saw you in the 10 times I was in your classroom, I saw you use graphic organizers with your kids 3 different times. Okay, I'm going to assume then that that means that you use that more often than those 3 times I was in there. I'm going to assume that was a thing you used quite a bit. I saw you often using cooperative learning in your classroom. I saw you using peer observation or peer evaluation, excuse me. I saw some student presentations, and I saw a lot of summarizing and note-taking on the part of your students. And so what we might do then, based on these observations that we saw, is go back and look at first your growth guide, and then the plan that we had on your growth plan to say, sorry, I'm having trouble getting back. You know, we said you wanted to go from developing to proficient. You know, based on what I've seen in our observations, I've seen, you know, evidence of practice. You did critical thinking activities X amount of times, and there were different methods that you used to ensure critical thinking each of those times. So that might be a way that we try to drive you forward in that. And the observation form becomes a good tool to do that. What should happen is each time that you get an observation done in your classroom, the evaluator, your principal, or whomever it is that's evaluating you, should give you a copy of what he or she wrote. That should be a thing. It shouldn't be a mystery to you what he or she wrote down. And you should keep the copies of those things for yourself, just in case it gets lost, or in case there's a discrepancy on what is said at the end of the year, et cetera. Anything that they give to you, that you should probably, as I said, keep a file for yourself, be it electronic or paper or a combination of both. But there should be some sort of an evaluation form. In the old days, what principals did is they went into a classroom once toward the beginning of the year and then once toward the end of the year, and they tried to determine your growth between those 2 times. More and more what you'll see is principals coming into classrooms, hopefully a lot. Hopefully they'll be in there multiple times throughout the semester, and they'll have documentation of each of those times so that you and he or she can help your improvement in the framework of your classroom. In some cases, if I, as a principal, am going through and I'm noticing that, you know, I'm going in to look for artifacts about 4.1, as we discussed, as a building, but I'm also noticing there's some stuff going on in there that's not conducive to learning. There's a lot of disruptive behavior. Students are throwing pencils or whatever. I'm noticing those things, and I'm noticing that multiple times, and I have kind of talked to you about that, but I'm not noticing any improvement on those things. Then in some cases, what we might do, if it's really negligible and it's really a detriment to student learning, then what we might do is do an improvement plan. Now, an improvement plan is different than a growth plan. The growth plan is for more of a personal goal, or sometimes, like I said, the district goal that's set. And that's, it's a symbiotic relationship between you and your administrator, or you and your evaluator. You're discussing with each other in a positive framework of what needs to get done. The improvement plan is a little bit different because I don't need to have your permission as an educator in your classroom to work with you in that. Okay, the improvement plan would be me as an administrator saying to you, you need to absolutely work on this. Your classroom management, your positive classroom environment is really taking a hit, and motivation and engagement for your students is really lacking. And so probably what I would do is try to speak with you as a teacher, and most teachers are willing to work with administrators on this. Some are not, however, and that's a big deal too. Nonetheless, the improvement target still gets filled out. There are strategies that we can brainstorm with each other, benchmarks and more specific timelines, and documentation of whether it was effective or not, okay? So an improvement plan, if we go back to this summative evaluation, the improvement plan would be something for an area of concern, okay? The growth plan might be a growth opportunity for you, but it wouldn't be a negative reflection on the evaluation itself. The improvement plan is probably, would be an area of concern. And so if there are multiple improvement plans, multiple areas of concern, that would be a concern for you as an educator, and perhaps your employment continued within the district. And I think that's it. Okay. So I just did a walkthrough of those documents, and it took me about 20 minutes to do that. That's too long, and I'm sorry that I didn't give you time to reflect and process in between that. It's hard to do that on Zoom, but I should have done. My own growth plan would say I should probably give you more opportunities for reflection on that. But I'm going to do that now. First, are there questions about these documents as you've seen them? Questions about how they might be used? I do think it's very important for you to see those documents before you go into a classroom setting, because sometimes they come at you and there's so many other things that come at you that first year of teaching, those first weeks especially, that it's easy to throw those things under the bus and not worry about them. Those are things that you should probably be familiar with, especially in the evaluative portion of it. You need to just keep that documentation. You don't have to do anything with it necessarily, but do keep it so that you have a record of what's going on.
I actually had a question.
Okay, Faith.
So how soon after that visit would you get the feedback from that?
For the observation,
Yes.
it will depend on how it's organized and how the administrator chooses to set it up. I'll just tell you about my own practice and process of how it went through. Initially, when I started as an administrator, I did everything on paper. So I would do it by hand, and I would kind of then go back to the office and write stuff up, and I'd try to get it to the person within the framework of the next couple of days, because sometimes it took me a while to write stuff up. We eventually changed our process, and we went to online. So I would go into your classroom with an iPad, and I had a little software program that I would click on, and I could actually email it to you right as I was walking out of the classroom, and then come back to you later on during your plan hour or something and speak with you about what I saw, which usually was fine. On occasion, there were some concerns that we had, and on some very rare occasions, maybe we would use that to do like an improvement plan, but only a handful of teachers that I ever worked with did I ever go the improvement plan route. So usually it was feedback of, I like what I saw on this, I really appreciated it. I tried to do it, especially after it was electronic, I tried to do it same day or next day at the latest. But I also had a fairly small staff and a fairly small building. And if you're in a larger area, I don't know how that would work. There might be different methods and different ways they would do that. But in general, with any feedback, the quicker that you can give it, the more quickly that it's internalized, and the more that you can still be on the same page. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Okay. Yep. Other questions? That's a good question.
What do you think our likelihood is of encountering these in a way before student teaching? Because like we are going in that fall semester, so we'll be kind of dealing with some of the things that teachers are doing beforehand.
Yeah. So actually, that's a really good segue to the next kind of activity. The answer to the first question is, like, the documents that I showed you, you as a student teacher will probably not see any of those documents directly. You shouldn't see those directly. You can ask your cooperating teacher what kind of documentation process they use in their district, and I would hope that he or she would show you at least the documents themselves, if not necessarily the ones that he or she is being evaluated on. That's a little too much, but you should have access to those documents. They should be able to show them to you. But you as a student teacher should not be evaluated on those documents, probably. What you should be evaluated on, I'll share my screen with you, is this. Give give me a thumbs up or just a yes or no if you've seen this before. I'm hopeful you have. The teacher candidate assessment rubric. Okay, this is what you should see. And so the standards are the same. It's not quite as in-depth as what I showed you, but you guys have been through this before. So actually, it's a good segue to the next activity. I'll have you do this for a few minutes, and we'll come back at the end and kind of talk about it. What I'm wanting you to do is open that in that agenda, that April 13th, April 20th agenda. I'll encourage you in your smaller groups to kind of open that teacher candidate assessment rubric, and also the growth guide, not the growth plan, but the growth guide, the longer document, the 47-pager. And what I want you to do is kind of look through that in groups of 2 or 3 and just see, if you score as a skilled candidate on the teacher candidate assessment rubric for a particular standard, choose a standard, it doesn't matter to me, then what might be the equivalent score on the teacher growth guide? So that'd be a good way to kind of get an answer to that question, Brian. So I'll actually have you guys do that now, maybe for about 8 to 10 minutes in a smaller group. Just kind of look through those things together and see what you think. Skilled candidate is the number 3, and you could also be an exceeding candidate, but I'll ask you to look at being a skilled candidate, because I think what process is that we ask you to average being a skilled candidate on all of those things, so that you can pass your student teaching experience. So let me create, I'm going to stop the recording now. There we go. Okay, so Zach, you mentioned some questions. What do you got?
All right. So on the growth guide, talked about us being proficient or distinguished, or even just emerging or growing. Like, where should we try to be at on that scale?
Well, that will depend on where you set yourself up on they'll have an initial scoring of where you are, and it can be here. Let me share it with you. You want the growth guide, or do you want the candidate assessment rubric? The growth guide for teaching in your own classroom, or do you want to look at the candidate assessment rubric for student teaching?
We were looking more at the growth guide.
Okay, let me share the growth guide with you then. Maybe my internet is being very funky right now. There we go. Okay, let's find the growth guide. Okay, so most of the time what will happen with this is you and your administrator, or you and your mentor teacher, or you within the framework of what they call your PLC, your professional learning community, will assess where you are at the beginning of the year. And so you look at kind of the evidence that's provided here, and for each of the standards there's evidence, an evidence sheet, and I kind of show that to you, but I kind of glossed over it a little bit. So you'll look at this possible sources of evidence. You see the document here, and your district may have a different way of doing this, but this is what we did in the district where I work. And you would look at these things, professional commitment, professional practice. And you would say, well, look, I already use independent, collaborative, and whole class learning situations. That's one thing I do. And I have a list of instructional strategies that I pull from, okay? And so if I look at that, and then I look at this growth plan, I'm sorry, no, sorry, not the growth plan. If I go back and look at 4.1, for instance, then if I look at, those things that I already do, then I can say, you know what, I feel like, with conversation with others, I feel like I'm in the developing portion of this. Okay, I feel like I'm a developing teacher, and here's the evidence that I can use to support that. Okay, I want to become a proficient teacher. And so in conversations with your administrator, with your evaluator, with your mentor teacher, or with your PLC group, you guys would kind of come up with this thing of what would it take to make me a proficient teacher? What would it look like in my classroom to be a proficient teacher? What would it look like in my student work? If I was to share examples of student work, what would it look like if I was in the proficient category as a teacher? And so you kind of go back to this, the sheet at the end, the possible sources of evidence, and you would say, do these already, want to move to this level, what extra things on this sheet would help me get there? Or you as a group, as a faculty, as a PLC group, as a mentor-mentee relationship, or as a teacher-administrator relationship, you may identify things that are beyond this document that would get you there. But the important thing is that you have a shared vision of how you get from point A to point B. And that shared vision can only happen through conversation, okay? And that's the real purpose of these guides is actual honest to goodness growth as educators. Sometimes we think of evaluation as hiring and firing, and it shouldn't be that. It shouldn't just be that. It should be, how do I, a teacher that's really good at my job, get even better at what's happening in my classroom? And that's how you kind of go about it. Here's what I already do. What would it take to get me to this next level? It's not set in stone. It's a shared conversation. And then how do you know that you can get to the point where you set out together? You know, what sources of evidence do you have? Does that help with that, Zach? Okay. What other questions do you have based on that, if any?
And then our other one was just like, won't there be different
Go ahead, Zach, and then we'll get Brian here in a second.
Sorry, Brian. Is there like different documents then for each state? I was just
For each
curious
what?
about that. For each state. Will there be like
Probably. Honestly, each state will have its own evaluative standards. They should look similar. I mean, like the standards, I mean, good teaching is good teaching. You should probably be able to lay that out in a way that looks similar from state to state, but the standards themselves will be different and the documentation will be different. And because, I mean, it's mandated that you have some sort of an evaluative system, and it should be based on the standards, but each district is free to create their own documentation too. And as I said, many larger districts probably do that. They'll probably have their own thing through their HR departments and all that sort of thing. It should be based on the MEES standards, but they may have their own documentation. A lot of smaller and mid-sized districts will use the DESE documents, and some will use some of the documents and then they'll create their own documents in-house. I created, for the district where I worked, I created my own observation forms. It was based on stuff that we talked about as a building. You know, here's what we want to work on. So I create the forms and get feedback from all the teachers and say, does this form look good for observation? Yeah, it's good. That's what we used. But again, it's a shared conversation in that way. It should always be a shared conversation. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it is really a top-down. Here's what we're doing. Here's what we're using. Get on board with it. That's not the healthiest way to do it. That's my opinion. Probably research backs me up on that. But they will look different. If you go to Iowa, go to Nebraska, go to Arkansas or Kansas, the documents will look different. Standards will probably be different, but hopefully they're not radically different. Brian, you had a question?
Yeah, so before COVID, I was doing practicum experience at Maryville High School.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it was great. The teacher was amazing. But I remember one day she was specifically ranting about this teacher evaluation document to me because she was mad that she didn't get 7s only because her district told them not to give out 7s. Mm-hmm. So how common is that?
Well, I can't speak to it. I can't speak to how common it is. It does happen. And in some cases, here, let me just, I'm going to turn off the recording. Okay, so when we come back next week, my plan is to start talking about stuff once again that you had voiced concerns about, like you felt underprepared for it or just was worrisome for you as you head into the classroom. And the one that really checked all the boxes for you guys was classroom management and different techniques and things like that. And so that's where we're going to go next week. When I had really set this up, obviously we were going to be in the classroom together, and it would have been a little easier to role play situations and things like that. So I don't know exactly how it's going to look. I'll have to look at that between now and next Monday. Remember, we don't do the face-to-face on Wednesdays. On Wednesdays. So by the time you get back here next Monday, I'll have looked at that, and I'll have just tips and techniques for you. Anything that I have that you want, you can have it. I have done various presentations and things for years, and I've got some things that you can have if you want. You just ask for them, and I'll send them to you. But that's what we'll do next week. We'll start with classroom management, and then I'll, depending on how far we get with that, the week after that, maybe something else, or we may continue with classroom management the week after. So that's the general plan. Any final thoughts or questions before we head out? I am very impressed with you guys. I'm very proud of what you've done. I know this has not been, here's the understatement of the millennia. It's not been ideal, but I appreciate your perseverance, and this will make you better educators in your classrooms when you get there. And I'm excited to see how it shakes out for you guys. So anyway, take care of yourselves, and we will see you next week.